I really enjoyed your presentation. It's very inspirational. What do you think about Ukraine right now? What are your thoughts about that in the refugee crisis? And it's sort of a two-part question. The second part is don't you find that with Europe as well as the United States right now, we're all deeply touched by Ukraine, but there's a certain hypocrisy about our energy policy with regard to there's over $1.5 billion a day going into Russia. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts about how we solve the problem and where it's going to end up.
Big question. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I've been documenting the conflict in Donbass since 2015. And last year I actually made a film about the region saying that I thought this was about to happen. So first off, what I would say is the fault of the West is not necessarily what's happening now, but the fact that for 7 years they have not dealt with the problem in Donbass. You know, we have to remember like over 10,000 people were killed in that area during the conflict, and most people didn't even know that was going on. So that was, you know, obviously there's earlier causes. I've been documenting the crisis in Syria, in many other places, which have been the impact of Putin's policies. So what we're seeing is just an extension of that because he was never held back it before. So obviously the situation is desperate now. I don't think, unfortunately, sanctions are going to stop Putin. I met one of the foreign ministers, Russian foreign ministers, a few years ago, and I remember him saying to me about Syria, because the thing about Putin is that his whole reason death threat, everything about him is about this kind of macho figure, so he can never back down. So unfortunately in Ukraine, there is no way that he can back down. So the only way he can be stopped is by being defeated. He's never going to kind of pull back and say, I made a mistake, or because he loses his job. And I could talk a lot about the whole Putin backstory. The sanctions in terms of oil, that has to be brought in because it is directly funding what he's doing, without question. I think that's where we as citizens have to make our leaders more aware that we are prepared to put up with those sacrifices, because that's the reason why, you know, our leadership is not putting those sanctions on, because they know that it's going to be, especially in Europe, it is going to cause a lot of financial problems for a lot of people. So therefore, as politicians always, their desire to win and get votes means that they won't do it because they're worried that the backlash against them is going to be huge. So the only way that will change is when citizens stand up and say, I am prepared to take a hit myself, I'm prepared to put up with this in order for this to stop, because it is the only way. Because the other sanctions, to be honest, have very little effect on Putin, certainly won't stop him, because all the funding comes through the oil and gas, especially in Europe. So, yeah, I mean, it's a desperate situation. I see it as a continuation of what I've been documenting for 15 years, from Grozny all the way through Syria to what's happening in Ukraine. And as I say, you know, I was working in Donbass just last year and could see what was happening. My NGO, we're doing small things. We just sent 300 wheelchairs. We're working with disability groups within Ukraine. We just bought 2 ambulances yesterday, and I'm going back there next week to carry on my work there within the country. But yeah, it's a terrible situation that's happened. I'm not doing this as a plug, but as something that is of interest. But I made a TV series for Vice about food. As my other passion is I'm a chef. So, but the series about food, we did one in Ukraine, and you can find it on YouTube, and it's just powerful to watch because it's about shared meals. And you see me sharing meals with soldiers and people. 3 of them, people in the film, are dead already. It's a very hard thing to watch now, but what you see is everyone just talking about how they wanted peace in that region, and what's been going on, and hopefully explaining the situation a little bit about why this is something that's been going on since 1930. Is the Russians trying to silence Ukraine, and the genocide started in 1930. This is a continuation of it.
Hi, Giles. Thank you so much. I'm Catherine. We've met before at UNHCR. I wanted to ask you, you know, you've dedicated your life, your career's work to centering humans, not necessarily calling them refugees, but, you know, centering the dignity of humans. But you've also kind of immersed yourself in a world of trauma. And I'm curious how you handle your own well-being and handle the vicarious trauma that you are so sort of exposed to. Thanks.
I think, you know, one of the words that I keep hearing a lot about is resilience. And, when lockdown happened 2 years ago, I had a lot of brands and individuals reach out to me and say, can you help us to be more resilient? Because I think everyone was kind of feeling we need to be more resilient. And actually my answer kind of surprised people, because I would say, actually, I don't think you can make yourself more resilient. I think resilience is the outcome of experience. And there's all these self-help books and all these things about resilience. And I said, well, actually, I believe when you're going through a really difficult time of suffering, pain, of challenges, that's like an athlete in training. And you have to find ways to get through it. And there's ways you can do that. You have to accept there's good days and bad days. I had plenty of days when I would just sit on the sofa and watch episodes of Frasier and didn't want to do anything. But we have to accept that that's part of a journey. But you have to feel positive about what happens at the end. And that's what I connect with all the stories I tell. People sometimes say to me, oh, you must have an amazing connection with the people, because they think of my injuries. And actually, most of the stories I do are not around injured people, and often it's around women who have suffered sexual violence and other things. Why we connect is because they always look at me and say, we can see you've suffered, but we can see how much you enjoy life now. And I think, going through such a difficult time has given me a resilience. And that's where I bond with Olive, with Khulud, with all the people that I document, because we've been given that gift, which is to see life for its fullness and the joy. And so I'm the happiest I've been in my life. And I share it with all these amazing people. So I think the reason I'm able to deal with it is because having gone through something similar and having come out of that with this resilience. I mean, 46 days was there where I couldn't communicate. I spent a year in hospital, 37 operations. On 2 occasions, my family was called in to say goodbyes. And to this day, I still in pain every day when I walk, and it's a struggle. But I laugh more, I enjoy life more. And so when I'm in really difficult places, I'm going to go to Ukraine next week, I'll be seeing some tragedies and seeing my friends go through this really difficult time. But I know we will sit there and we will celebrate life as well. And so I think that's the life's gift. That's maybe Kismet, that's fate that has given me, because Kismet especially is the idea of fate for a reason. And so maybe my journey has given me the ability to be able to carry on doing the work I do.
Okay, one more question.
Hi, Giles. Really love the presentation. It touched me personally as a man who's both suffered and committed violence to other human beings many, many times. I apologize for not having my mask. I have my favorite Cuban flag mask on. Thank you for fucking that up. It's full of snot right now. But as you stated, you said that the sanctions and everything don't do nothing. And I just heard someone say today, because they were talking about boycotting a fight with a Russian fighter. And the guy said, let's not be hypocrites. If we boycotted the United States every time we occupied an area, what the hell are we going to do, right? So I got the point of that, but what do we do, right? If it's not the money, obviously you have this work that opens people's eyes and touches us in such a way. Aside from having that awareness, what do we do?
I mean, I look at it the same way environmental issues and other things that have changed, policy has changed simply because of people's voices. Everything is run by capitalism. Even in Russia, it's all about money. And, it was President Eisenhower that said it best when he finished his presidency, where he said that the greatest threat to American society was the American industrial military complex. The profit that was being made from war. I mean, Eisenhower was one of the greatest generals of all time, a military man, and even he could see that was the greatest threat. I've been reporting on Afghanistan for many years. I was there in July last year as everything collapsed. And you look at the money that was spent on that country. We could have given every single Afghan civilian $50,000 each for the cost of the war. And that's a country where the average income is about $9,000. So we could have just handed out $50,000. Now, what impact would that have had compared to bombing it for that amount of time? So, yeah, I totally agree with you. When we're talking about Ukraine and what Putin's doing, I've sat in Iraq. Over 500,000 people have died in conflicts since 9/11 that were carried out by the West. That is a reality, and we have to all bear responsibility for it and look to ways that we can end war by putting pressure on our politicians, by putting pressure on the companies that make profits from it. It's a small step, but I remember sitting in South Africa a few years ago with a lot of the guys that were involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And we were discussing this, and I said, sometimes I feel completely helpless, fighting against war. What's the point? And they said, yeah, we used to sit here and feel exactly the same. But all you can do is all you can do. And that's the same for me, is like, there's no point turning away and saying, I don't think I can change anything. I will carry on telling stories, I will carry on campaigning, and I hope the next generation or the generation after that will turn to their politicians and say, you know what, I do not believe in spending this amount of money on defense every year, when what we use that money for is to kill people around the world. And we all have to look at that. We all have to turn to our leaders. You know, Russians have to turn to Putin. We have to turn to our own leaders and say war can no longer be the solution.